Welcome to the UDL Showcase with Dr. Shauna Takis from KPU and BCIT and Piper from ACE-BC. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is a curriculum design, development, and delivery framework. It seeks to include the maximum number of learners in instruction by offering multiple paths to learning outcomes, which in turn supports the development of expert learners. The UDL framework focuses on 3 networks of learning. It supports multiple means of engagement, the why of learning, representation, the what of learning, and finally, action and expression, the how of learning. Why UDL and why now? UDL emerged in the early 1980s as a way to include students with disabilities in mainstream education. Compiling research on disability, learning, and assistive technology indicated that broader scale work on designing flexible, access-driven curriculum could support all learners. We also saw that variation in learning can be predicted using the UDL networks, which is very handy in planning accessible classrooms. The flexibility of UDL and its emphasis on meaningfulness allow it to encompass the diversity of post-secondary environments and address barriers to learning. Neuroscientific research taught us that there are 3 main networks in learning. There's the affective network, or the why of learning. This has to do with engagement. For purposeful, motivated learners, make sure that you stimulate interest and motivation for learning. The second network is the recognition network, or the what of learning. This is the representation network. For resourceful, knowledgeable learners, present information and content in different ways. The third network is the strategic network, or the how of learning. This is also called action and expression. For strategic, goal-directed learners, differentiate the ways that students can express what they know. This is the UDL framework. It's organized in 2 different ways. It's organized vertically according to the networks we just described on the previous slide. You can read across the top: engagement, representation, and action and expression. The framework is also organized horizontally. At the top, you can see the access level. Next is the build level. Next is the internalize level. And finally, at the bottom is the goal level. This tells us what we hope to develop as expert learners. Expert learners are people who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable. They're also strategic and goal-directed. Often, it can be helpful to talk about barriers even before we start thinking about universal design for learning. Acknowledging a wide variety of barriers and proactively designing for them is the rationale for providing multiple pathways in the UDL framework. Barriers can exist in many forms. They can be sensory, experiential, educational, cognitive, and physical. Barriers can be related to pacing, information density, content familiarity, motivation, and self-efficacy. Barriers can be financial. They can also arise due to attitudes such as racism, ableism, and classism. UDL supports proactive design with a multitude of barriers in mind, supporting explicit inquiry into accessibility and getting valuable learner feedback on both barriers and design. Voice and choice. UDL supports learner voice and learner choice. UDL supports learner voice by supporting student agency in making decisions, in providing feedback, in connecting content with experience, and in learning to reflect upon and advancing one's own educational experience. UDL also supports learner choice by emphasizing the diversity in learning and designing for multiple paths for reaching goals. UDL asks if the design of curricula provides options as a means of expanding accessibility for all learners. If you don't feel ready to work with the UDL framework, you can start with some best practices. UDL aims to create expert learners who are purposeful, motivated, resourceful, strategic, and goal-directed. UDL pivots on the idea that there is a wide diversity in learning and learners and must design for that diversity from the start. You can start thinking about UDL proactively. UDL advocates pedagogy that is proactively designed around barriers to learning and providing multiple options and opportunity for student voice. You can start by asking, where are the multiple options in your design? UDL advocates pedagogical expectations that are clear, concrete, and actionable, which supports goal setting, community building, and perseverance. You can think about ways of designing meaningful, relevant learning activities and assessments. You can also think about canvassing students frequently for feedback to move accessible, flexible design forward. So you're ready to think about UDL implementation. Where to begin? Well, you can start with grassroots implementation. This means that you start with instructors and students. You start at the smallest scale and you engage in experimentation and feedback. You ask a question like, where else can UDL fit? And you expand from the ground up, from assessments, from learning activities, and from courses. You can also think about implementing UDL from above. In this scheme, you integrate UDL with existing initiatives, departments, organizational structures, and funding. You can examine allocated roles and time release for UDL development. You can connect across academic and service departments such as teaching and learning, accessibility services, and IT. You can also look larger scale at program design and renewal. Regardless of how you decide to implement UDL, you should have an implementation plan. An implementation plan is crucial for bridging the complexity of the framework with institutional priorities. It's important to develop implementation categories based on a needs analysis. You can create theory to practice channels. You can establish and track deliverables with an implementation plan. It also allows you to scale up to program review and development, and at the same time allows you to scale down to class practices such as assessment. The Accessible British Columbia Act explicitly refers to universal design. The Accessible BC Act was passed in June 2021. It establishes a legal framework to identify, remove, and prevent barriers to the full and equal participation of people with disabilities in BC. It does this by enabling the development of accessibility standards and introducing new accessibility requirements for government and prescribed organizations. Importantly, the Accessible BC Act centers the voices and experiences of people with disabilities. In developing a proposed accessibility standard, the Provincial Accessibility Committee must consider the following principles: inclusion, adaptability, diversity, collaboration, self-determination, and universal design. An important question to ask: what can UDL mean for deaf and hard of hearing students? There are quite a few priorities we want to consider in universal design when we're thinking about supporting students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Things like learning materials in a timely fashion, pre-planned and designed captioning, accessible documents, readily available interpreters, helping everyone in the classroom understand the role of interpreters, readily available learning specialists and tutors who are familiar with the barriers for deaf and hard of hearing learners, overall recognition of the deaf and hard of hearing community and its culture. It's important to consider how to support community in educational settings more broadly. And in these settings, our goal is to have no need to disclose or explain disability. Here are some important resources you can use on UDL, assessment, and inclusive practice. Just click on the links.